Hello everyone, tonight we begin with the wild and unsettling life of a man who terrified armies without ever painting his face. Crazy Horse. From visions of thunder spirits whispering on lonely hills, to luring 80 US soldiers to their deaths with nothing more than calm eyes and a steady horse, to dying not in battle but under a soldier's bayonet during a friendly meeting, his story is equal parts legend, tragedy, and dark comedy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange journeys we take together. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I love picturing who's out there with me, listening across time zones. Now, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pour some tea, or just listen with the soft hum of your fan in the background. Let's ease into tonight's story, the wild tale of how Crazy Horse earned his name, and why silence can sometimes be the loudest defiance of all. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, and brace yourself, because you weren't going to be born into the gentle arms of a maternity ward with pink balloons and a nurse telling your parents how precious you look. No, you would have slipped into the world around 1840, somewhere on the northern plains, into a society where your very first lullabies were Lakota chants and your first toys were more likely bits of buffalo sinew than plastic rattles. And get this, you wouldn't even have had your own name yet. That came later, after you'd shown a bit of worth. For now, your parents would have called you something simple, Ha, oh ha, Among the Trees, a poetic enough title, though perhaps not the one you'd want carved on a future monument. Still, trees beat baby with jaundice as a starting point. Your father, he was already called Crazy Horse, a respected healer among the Oglala Lakota. The kind of man people sought out when fevers broke or when visions clouded their nights. Your mother, Rattling Blanket Woman, belonged to the Minikanju band. Her name alone is enough to make you realize how bland Jennifer or Mike sounds in comparison. She carried with her not just lineage but songs, stories, and the weight of survival in a world where winter could casually decide who lived or froze. And before you romanticize it, no, this wasn't the Pinterest version of the Great Plains with wild horses galloping under golden sunsets. This was a hard, raw world. Bison were your economy, your religion, your refrigerator, and your winter coat. Lose them, and you weren't shopping for alternatives, you were negotiating starvation. But here's the odd twist of your birthright. From day one, your community would have expected you to become more than just another boy chasing prairie dogs with a stick. You were Lakota, and that meant you were being groomed into an entire worldview where bravery wasn't optional. Generosity wasn't just Nissit, was the highest form of status, and spiritual power mattered as much as muscle. Even as a baby, swaddled in the arms of women who hummed prayers over you, you were stepping into a life where the line between ordinary child and potential leader was thinner than the smoke curling from the lodge fire. Did you cry too long? Perhaps a spirit was whispering. Did you stare too intently at the flames? Maybe the thunder beings were already taking an interest. It was an atmosphere where every cough had cosmic implications, and every dream might have been a prophecy. Try explaining that pressure to a modern toddler clutching an iPad. And while you were finding your feet, your parents were navigating the fragile alliances of bands, the encroaching push of settlers, and the eternal dance of hunting and ceremony. Your mother's people, the Minikanju, carried their own proud histories, blending into your bloodline a second thread of Lakota defiance. You weren't just among the trees, you were among the expectations of two worlds, each waiting to see what kind of man you'd become. But here's the kicker, your life wasn't destined to be loud. Unlike some boys who strutted early, flaunting their feathers, you carried the quiet aura of someone apart. Your very beginning hinted at a paradox, standing out not through noise, but through silence. A boy born into a nation that valued humility so deeply that even greatness had to look modest. And that's where the real story starts, because being among the trees was just the beginning. Soon enough, those same trees would whisper about this strange boy with light hair, a boy who looked as though the sun had half bleached him before he even learned to ride. So here you are, among the trees, toddling around the plains, and already people are staring. Not because you've invented fire with a stick, or because you've said something profound at age 3. No, it's your hair, that stubbornly light, almost sandy hair that refuses to play along with the usual raven black norm. Imagine being the only blondish kid in a nation of glossy braids. Congratulations. You've become the living equivalent of a blinking neon sign in a culture that prized blending in. And oh, the nicknames. Forget Curly Sue or Goldilocks. You'd be called Curly or Light-Haired Boy. Harmless enough. Sure, but also the kind of labels that followed you around like a shadow you couldn't shake. While other boys melted into the background of buffalo hunts and foot races, you shone literally. Even as you tried to sit quietly, your head looked like it had been dusted with prairie sunlight. It made you memorable, which was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, elders kept an eye on you, noting your seriousness, your tendency to watch rather than chatter. On the other hand, you could never slip under the radar. If you tripped, everyone saw. If you stumbled in a childish game, people whispered. A boy with light hair was never just another boy. He was already marked as different, touched, maybe even chosen. And you didn't help your case by being so odd about it. While others loved to boast, show off a good horse, brag about an arrow shot, you stayed quiet, withdrawn. You gave things away instead of hoarding them, which, in Lakota culture, was actually the surest way to earn respect. Generosity was the gold standard, and you wore it naturally, as if the thunder beings themselves had slipped it into your crib. But don't imagine this as some Instagram influencer glow-up. You weren't treated like a celebrity toddler. Lakota society valued modesty above all else. Flaunt yourself too much, and you'd be smacked down, metaphorically if not literally. Still, there was that sense. The boy with light hair might have something in store. Meanwhile, your peers were already measuring you. Rival boys squinted at your pale strands, muttering. Girls noted the difference, but in that subtle, calculating way that children use when they're already thinking about alliances and futures. Everyone could sense you were out of sync. Not wrong, not weak, just offbeat. And sometimes offbeat is more dangerous than outright failure. What did this mean for you? That you were destined to grow up with an air of distance. You weren't loud in council lodges. You didn't wrestle to prove dominance. You didn't stuff your hair with feathers to catch attention. You existed at a tilt, neither outside nor fully inside, which, ironically, is exactly the sort of place visionaries and future leaders tend to stand. Too strange to be ignored, too reserved to be dismissed. And so the whispers grew. People began to expect something from you, though they couldn't quite say what. You were already being shaped not just by your parents, but by the collective gaze of a community that marked you out as unusual before you even rode your first horse. Of course, you couldn't stay Curly forever. A new name would eventually come, but not before the spirits themselves decided to interfere. And let me tell you, when they did, it wasn't with a polite tap on the shoulder. It was with a vision that would rip your young world wide open. By the time you could climb onto a pony without tumbling off like a sack of laundry, people had already noticed something else about you. You weren't just that pale-haired kid with the quiet eyes anymore. You were unnervingly good with horses. Not just, oh look, he doesn't fall off much. More like, the animals seemed to actually like you. While other boys got bucked, you were the one galloping bareback through the grass, as if you'd been born with hooves instead of feet. It didn't stop there. Bow in hand. You weren't showy, but you were efficient. You didn't posture like some boys, holding their kill aloft and crowing to the heavens. You simply brought back the meat, shared it out, and walked away. And that, strangely enough, earned you more respect than any war cry. Lakota culture didn't exactly reward luck. The greatest compliment you could earn wasn't brave or strong, but generous. And you, without even trying, seemed to embody that. Of course, this meant that while other kids were busy polishing their reputations by bragging about who outran who or who shot the most rabbits, you were quietly building something different, a kind of mystique. People began to say, that boy doesn't brag, which, in a society allergic to arrogance, made you magnetic. You were becoming known not for how much you said, but for how much you didn't. And here's where it gets funny, because being modest in a warrior culture doesn't mean you get left alone. It means everyone keeps watching to see what you'll do next. You, the kid who gave away horses instead of hoarding them. You, the boy who treated spoils of hunts like passing gifts instead of trophies. Everyone knew there was something unusual about that. You started to carry a kind of quiet weight among your peers. They joked, they wrestled, they jostled for rank in the usual ways. But you slipped past the jostling like a shadow. The adults noticed. Elders whispered that your path might not be like the others, and though you never said it out loud, you began to feel it too. But let's not make this sound too saintly. You were still a boy. You raced horses across the prairie until your chest burned, You played games that mimicked war. You laughed around the fire. The difference was, when the laughter ended, you didn't stick around to retell your triumphs for the 5th time. You drifted back into that silence that would eventually define you. And silence, by the way, is a dangerous thing. People project onto it. They fill the gaps with their own ideas. Some thought you were destined for greatness. Others thought you might be touched by spirits. Either way, you were being sculpted by other people's expectations long before you chose a path yourself. So here you were, a boy, not yet a man, already known for uncanny horsemanship, deadly aim, humility bordering on unsettling, and generosity that shamed your louder peers. You were building a reputation without even trying. And reputations, once they gather momentum, are hard to stop. But the plains weren't done shaping you yet, because sooner or later, every Lakota youth had to seek something more than food and friendship. You'd be sent alone, fasting, to cry out to the spirits for a vision, and what came to you there would haunt your steps for the rest of your life. So far, you've been the pale-haired boy who could ride circles around his friends and give away horses like they were Halloween candy. But sooner or later, every Lakota youth had to stop coasting on talent and face the serious business of finding out what the universe wanted from them. That meant a Hanbalea vision quest. And unlike your modern version of finding yourself by scrolling inspirational quotes, this was the real deal. Fasting alone. No food, no water, no company. Out on the prairie, where even the wind felt like it was judging you. They didn't sugarcoat it. You went out there to suffer. The hunger, the thirst, the hallucinations, those weren't considered problems. They were the doorway, because the point wasn't to come back rested and refreshed. It was to come back marked. And so you climbed to a high place, left behind the chatter of campfires, and sat with the silence, waiting to see if anything beyond the human world cared enough to answer. And it did. What came to you was no gentle bedtime story. In your vision, you saw a rider on horseback. But here's the detail that matters. The rider wore no war paint, no feathers, no jewelry, no shining ornaments at all. His hair streamed loose, unbound, not braided in the way of Lakota warriors. He carried nothing that looked like status, nothing that said, "Look at me." Instead, he radiated a kind of raw, stripped-down power, as if by shedding every ornament, he had become untouchable. And then came the Thunder Beings. Lakota cosmology isn't shy about its spirits. The Thunder Beings, those terrifying, sky-splitting forces of storm and lightning, were there in your vision, circling, protective, maybe even claiming you. To have them appear wasn't just impressive, it was dangerous. They weren't the kind of spirits you bragged about. They were the kind that could burn your life to ash if you misused their gift. What did it mean? The elders interpreted it carefully. You were being told to live differently. No paint, no feathers, no ornaments. Fight with humility, as if the power itself would guard you. The world was warning you. Vanity kills, simplicity saves. And you believed it. From that moment on, you refused to decorate yourself like other warriors. You went into battle plain, stripped down, almost anonymous, which, ironically, made you unforgettable. Imagine being 13, maybe 14, and coming back to camp with that kind of vision tucked under your skin. You didn't rush into the center lodge shouting about it. You kept it quiet, held it like a hidden ember. But everyone could see the shift. You weren't just curly anymore. You were the boy who had seen the rider without paint. The boy the Thunder Beings had brushed with lightning. And here's where it gets deliciously ironic. In a culture that loved ceremony and symbolism, your path was to reject ceremony and symbolism. Everyone else painted themselves for war, red for blood, black for victory, white for mourning, and you rode out looking like you'd forgotten to get dressed. And yet, instead of making you seem ordinary, it set you apart even more. So, the pale-haired boy with quiet eyes had crossed the threshold. You weren't just unusual anymore. You were marked, not by people, but by spirits. And from that moment, you would carry their message into every step you took. But of course, a vision is just a vision until it's tested. And your test was coming when you would have to earn a new name. Not from your parents, not from your friends, but from your deeds. You came down from that hill, gaunt, thirsty, and probably smelling like you'd been wrestling coyotes. But you carried something heavier than hunger, a vision that refused to let go. Now, the Lakota didn't treat visions like random dreams you tell at breakfast. No one was saying, "Oh, funny, I dreamed of a rider too." No, Visions were contracts. They were binding, cosmic job descriptions handed to you whether you liked them or not. Yours was brutally clear. Live without ornament. Fight without vanity. Ride with humility, and the thunder beings would walk beside you. Sounds noble, right? Except it also meant you had to reject every single shiny thing your peers were obsessed with. Imagine being a teenager and turning down feathers, beads, paints all. The social bling that made other boys look fierce and important. You weren't allowed to strut. You weren't allowed to show off. You were called to be plain, which of course made you unforgettable. Because here's the joke the spirits never told you. When you're the only one without war paint, everyone notices. You ride into battle looking like you've just wandered off the prairie without even combing your hair, and suddenly enemies start whispering, "Who's that rider? Why isn't he marked? Does he think he's too powerful to need protection?" And just like that, your very refusal to decorate yourself became its own terrifying decoration. Among your people, humility wasn't weakness, it was a kind of shield. By not boasting, you avoided envy. By not flaunting, you avoided curses. Your vision essentially made you untouchable in a society where spiritual power mattered as much as physical skill. And you leaned into it. You stopped seeking attention. You gave away spoils, kept to yourself, and carried yourself with the kind of calm that made people uneasy. It wasn't theatrics. It was discipline born from that vision on the hill. But don't think this turned you into some gloomy ascetic sitting alone muttering about destiny. You still laughed, rode hard, and joined hunts. The difference was, every action of yours was quietly threaded with that vow. No paint, no ornaments, no pride. Your peers wore feathers taller than their heads. You let your hair fall loose. They painted lightning across their faces. You carried the storm inside your silence. And the elders, they noticed. They began to murmur that you were different, that the spirits had chosen you for something larger. Not because you shouted about it, but because you lived it. You didn't have to tell people about your vision. They saw it in your behavior, in the way you stripped yourself of the trappings they clung to. The irony. By refusing to stand out, you stood out more. Your plainness became its own legend. Children whispered your story. Warriors pointed to your quiet confidence. And even rivals began to wonder what kind of unseen shield protected you. That's how visions work. They turn the ordinary into the ominous, and suddenly you weren't just curly anymore. You were the boy who carried thunder on his shoulders, even if your tunic was plain and your horse unpainted. And soon enough, it would be time to take on a new name to match this invisible armor. Not one you invented yourself, but one heavy with inheritance, passed down by your father. A name that sounded wild, dangerous, even unstable, and yet would become one of the most feared and respected in the history of the plains. You came down from that hill gaunt, thirsty, and probably smelling like you'd been wrestling coyotes, but you carried something heavier than hunger, a vision that refused to let go. Now, the Lakota didn't treat visions like random dreams you tell at breakfast. No one was saying, "Oh, funny, I dreamed of a rider too." No, visions were contracts. They were binding, cosmic job descriptions handed to you whether you liked them or not. Yours was brutally clear. Live without ornament. Fight without vanity. Ride with humility, and the thunder beings would walk beside you. Sounds noble, right? Except it also meant you had to reject every single shiny thing your peers were obsessed with. Imagine being a teenager and turning down feathers, beads, paintsol, the social bling that made other boys look fierce and important. You weren't allowed to strut. You weren't allowed to show off. You were called to be plain, which of course made you unforgettable. Because here's the joke the spirits never told you. When you're the only one without war paint, everyone notices. You ride into battle looking like you've just wandered off the prairie without even combing your hair, and suddenly enemies start whispering, "Who's that rider? Why isn't he marked? Does he think he's too powerful to need protection?" And just like that, your very refusal to decorate yourself became its own terrifying decoration. Among your people, humility wasn't weakness, it was a kind of shield. By not boasting, you avoided envy. By not flaunting, you avoided curses. Your vision essentially made you untouchable in a society where spiritual power mattered as much as physical skill. And you leaned into it. You stopped seeking attention. You gave away spoils, kept to yourself, and carried yourself with the kind of calm that made people uneasy. It wasn't theatrics. It was discipline born from that vision on the hill. But don't think this turned you into some gloomy ascetic sitting alone muttering about destiny. You still laughed, rode hard, and joined hunts. The difference was, every action of yours was quietly threaded with that vow. No paint, no ornaments, no pride. Your peers wore feathers taller than their heads. You let your hair fall loose. They painted lightning across their faces. You carried the storm inside your silence. And the elders, though they noticed, they began to murmur that you were different, that the spirits had chosen you for something larger. Not because you shouted about it, but because you lived it. You didn't have to tell people about your vision. They saw it in your behavior, in the way you stripped yourself of the trappings they clung to. The irony, by refusing to stand out, you stood out more. Your plainness became its own legend. Children whispered your story. Warriors pointed to your quiet confidence. And even rivals began to wonder what kind of unseen shield protected you. That's how visions work. They turn the ordinary into the ominous. And suddenly you weren't just curly anymore. You were the boy who carried thunder on his shoulders, even if your tunic was plain and your horse unpainted. And soon enough, it would be time to take on a new name to match this invisible armor. Not one you invented yourself, but one heavy with inheritance, passed down by your father. A name that sounded wild, dangerous, even unstable, and yet would become one of the most feared and respected in the history of the plains. Once you carried the name, you couldn't just sit around braiding grass and nodding wisely. Among the Lakota, manhood wasn't a theoretical debate. It was tested in raids, hunts, and the occasional hair-raising encounter with enemies who were very much trying to shorten your life expectancy. And so you stepped into warfare first, small, then larger, always under the gaze of people who now expected Crazy Horse to mean something. Your early fights weren't yet against the looming tide of US soldiers. They were against the familiar adversaries of the Plainscrow, Shoshone, Pawnee. Raids for horses, skirmishes over hunting grounds, ambushes where victory wasn't counted by land gained but by honor earned. These weren't random acts of teenage recklessness. They were structured, ritualized, and deeply tied to Lakota notions of bravery. And here's where you started to shine, or rather, unsettle. Other young men rode into battle decked out like human flags, painted faces, feathers, medicine bags clinking from their saddles. You looked like you'd forgotten the dress code. Loose hair, plain clothing, no bright colors. And yet, when the clash began, you rode directly into the thick of it, calm as if you were herding buffalo. Witnesses remembered that calmness. Where others shouted, you were silent. Where others waved weapons theatrically, you simply charged. It was unnerving. Two enemies, you seemed like a figure from some nightmare vision, too plain, too steady, too untouched by fear. To your own people, it was confirmation. The vision had been real. The thunder beings had indeed touched you. You began to earn respect, not just for courage, but for a very specific kind of courage. You weren't reckless. You didn't waste lives or chase pointless glory. But when danger came, you placed yourself where it was sharpest. And then, when the raid was done, you gave away what you'd won. Horses shared, spoils distributed, no boasting, no tallying. Just that unnerving humility again, like you were almost embarrassed by your own success. It didn't make you universally loved. Some peers resented you, muttered that you acted different, too solemn, too strange. But resentment only fueled the aura, because in a culture where boasting was scorned, your refusal to play the game made you more magnetic. You were building a reputation as a warrior who fought fiercely, gave generously, and remained silent. In other words, the exact opposite of every loudmouth your peers were getting tired of. But raiding was never just about proving yourself. It was training for what was coming, though you didn't yet know it. Those early battles honed your instincts, gave you the muscle memory for combat, and taught you the rhythms of fear and defiance. And they gave your name weight. Crazy Horse was no longer just a title passed down from your father. It was becoming shorthand for the kind of warrior who terrified enemies, not through spectacle, but through a kind of quiet inevitability. Still, these were the easier days. Raids, skirmishes, victories to retell at the lodge fires. Soon enough, the contests would grow larger, the stakes higher, because while you were proving yourself against Crow and Shoshone, the United States was moving closer, treaties were fraying, and the great storm of expansion was about to crash over the plains. But before you collided with empires, you had to stumble through something far more personal: love, jealousy, and a tragedy that would sear itself into your soul. Up to now, your story's been almost cinematic visions: horses, raids, names. But here's the thing about being human. Even when everyone insists you're carrying thunder in your back pocket, you can't dodge heartbreak. And in your case, heartbreak didn't arrive gently. It came wrapped in grief and jealousy, a combination that left scars deeper than any battlefield wound. First, there was your mother, rattling blanket woman. She died when you were still young, and that kind of loss hit harder in Lakota life than in most. Mothers weren't just caregivers, they were the weavers of spirit, the first teachers of generosity and humility, the ones who told you the stories that stitched your place in the cosmos. Losing her wasn't simply losing a parent, it was losing a compass. You grew quieter after that, more inward, carrying an ache that never quite softened. But the second blow came later, and it was messier. You fell in love. Not surprising, you were young, respected, unusual enough to draw attention. But love in a tightly woven society is rarely simple. The woman you cared for was already bound to another man, and jealousy brewed. Her husband confronted you, and in the violent tangle that followed, he was killed. Now, pause here. Some retellings soften this part of your story, blur the edges. But the truth is blunt. You were tangled in a love triangle, and it ended in death. And for a man raised on visions of humility and cosmic balance, that was catastrophic. He carried guilt, heavy as a boulder, and guilt doesn't just wound, it transforms. Instead of collapsing under it, you withdrew further. You didn't turn bitter, didn't turn cruel. You turned inward, doubled down on the discipline your vision demanded. Where others might have boasted of conquest, you shrank from it. Where others sought to prove themselves louder, you became quieter still. The tragedy drove you into yourself, hardening your rejection of vanity. If anything, it intensified the eerie aura around you. Imagine how it looked to others. Here was Crazy Horse, who fought bravely, gave generously, refused paint, and now carried himself with a gravity that came from personal grief. He became harder to approach, harder to read. The silences lengthened, the humility sharpened. To many it looked like the spirits had deepened their hold on you. To you, it was simply survival living with mistakes too heavy to speak aloud. And here's where irony comes in again. The very tragedies that could have undone you made you more formidable. The pain hollowed you out, but that hollow became a vessel for something larger. People began to sense that you weren't just different, you were dangerous in the way grief sharpens a blade. So the pale-haired boy with thunder visions was reshaped by heartbreak. You learned that personal wounds could bleed into public strength. You learned that silence could carry more weight than 1,000 boasts. And though you didn't know it yet, those lessons were preparing you for a larger stage, because while jealousy and death had scarred your private life, soon you'd be facing a new kind of betrayal. The slow, grinding encroachment of an empire that didn't care about your visions, your name, or your grief. Your personal storms had already carved you into something harder, quieter, sharper. But grief wasn't the only force reshaping your world. Out beyond the buffalo herds and the camps of Lakota bands, another storm was brewing, a storm with wagons, rails, treaties, and a taste for land it didn't own. Enter the United States. And if you think empire expansion is a polite handshake followed by a zoning meeting, you've clearly never read a treaty. The first cracks came with papers signed in faraway rooms, agreements like the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. Words on parchment promised the Lakota control of their hunting grounds, guaranteed protection, even respect. Lovely, except within a decade. Wagon trains were cutting ruts through those same hunting grounds, forts were sprouting like weeds, and respect translated into soldiers building roads where you grazed your horses. You didn't need to read English to know what was happening. You saw it in the shrinking herds of buffalo, the scarred landscapes, the missionaries turning sacred spaces into classrooms for obedience. You saw it in the eyes of elders who muttered about broken promises while U.S. agents smiled thinly and handed out rations that tasted like chalk. For someone like you who already mistrusted vanity, who already carried the weight of visions, the encroachment looked less like progress and more like cosmic insult. You weren't loud about it. You didn't deliver fiery speeches. That wasn't your way. But your resistance brewed in action, not words. While some leaders tried negotiations, you leaned toward defiance. You'd seen enough broken promises to know the pattern. Treaty, betrayal, repeat. And then came the Second Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868, another shimmering piece of paper declaring the Black Hills sacred and untouchable by settlers. It was barely dry before gold hunters were crawling over those very hills like ants on sugar. You didn't need thunder spirits to tell you what came next. Soldiers would follow, then violence, then endless demands to shrink Lakota lands further. You weren't naive. You understood what encroachment meant in flesh and bone. Less land meant fewer buffalo. Fewer buffalo meant hunger. Hunger meant dependence on us. Rations dependence meant control. And control meant death of your people's freedom. So you defied it, not in speeches, but in actions, blocking roads, resisting forts, striking at supply lines. Quiet rebellion that roared louder than words ever could. To outsiders, maybe it looked like obstinance, the tantrums of a savage chief. To you, it was simple arithmetic. No land, no life. You weren't fighting for abstract ideals. You were fighting for oxygen. And yet, even in this rising defiance, you clung to humility. You didn't strut about camp, declaring yourself the savior of your people. You kept your voice low, your actions sharp, and let others do the talking, which, ironically, made your defiance harder to counter. How do you silence a man who barely speaks? By the mid-1860s, your reputation as a warrior had fused with your reputation as a resistor. You weren't just Crazy Horse anymore. You were Crazy Horse who wouldn't bend, who treated you promises like smoke. And as the empire pressed harder, you pressed back. But defiance isn't just about saying no. It's about proving that no has teeth. And the moment to prove it arrived in 1866, when you helped lure 80 US soldiers into an ambush that would become legend. Here's the thing about empires. They hate being told no. By 1866, the US Army had sprinkled forts across your hunting grounds like bad furniture in someone else's house. Fort Phil Kearny, in particular, sat like a splinter in Lakota territory. Guarding the so-called Bozeman Trailer Road, settlers insisted on using, despite your people's very clear instructions. Do not. So, you and others decided to give them a demonstration lesson in no means no. The result became known as the Fetterman fight. And if you'd been there, you wouldn't have been watching from the sidelines. You would have been at the center, playing the role you'd already perfected. The decoy. Picture it. A group of soldiers, green enough to think discipline means polishing buttons, stare across the prairie and see you unpainted, unadorned, hair loose, calmly riding just out of reach. You're not shouting, not taunting, just glancing back with that unnerving calm, as if you're saying, "Catch me if you can." And because overconfidence is a universal human trait, they did. Captain William Fetterman had been warned not to chase too far. His orders were clear: don't pursue beyond sight of the fort. But when he saw you, a lone rider darting just out of reach, he couldn't resist. Maybe he thought you were careless. Maybe he thought he'd capture you and return a hero. Maybe he just couldn't stand the idea of being outmaneuvered by a 20-something warrior with hair like prairie straw. So he took the bait. You led him and 80 men further and further, across the ridge, over the hill until, suddenly, the quiet plains exploded. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors rose from concealment. The soldiers had walked into the teeth of an ambush so perfect it felt scripted. In less than an hour, all 80 men were dead. It was the US Army's worst defeat on the plains up to that point. And your role, central to the decoy tactic, became legendary. Proof of your cunning and calm under pressure. You didn't scream into battle. You lured them into it. You turned patience into a weapon, silence into a trap. It was the embodiment of your vision, fighting without ornament, without theatrics, and winning anyway. Now, to outsiders, the news landed like a thunderclap. To settlers, it was a nightmare headline. Savages slaughter soldiers. To the army, it was humiliation. But to your people, it was vindication. The Thunder Beings had not lied. The quiet boy who refused feathers and paint had drawn 80 soldiers to their deaths with nothing more than steady eyes and a horse's stride. And yet, true to form, you didn't brag. You didn't hold speeches at the fire, didn't demand songs in your honor. Others might have shouted their names into history. You just kept riding, which of course made the legend louder. But the Empire doesn't forget humiliation. The defeat only hardened you. Resolve ensured more forts, more soldiers, more roads. And if Fetterman's annihilation had been a thunderclap, the real storm was still building. You would soon face bigger battles, bigger risks, and the chance to carve your name into the kind of history even your enemies couldn't erase. If the Fetterman fight was a slap to the US Army's pride, the Battle of the Rosebud was a full-on shove down the stairs. By 1876, the tension had grown unbearable. Gold had been found in the Black Hills, your sacred Black Hills, promised by treaty to be untouchable. And if there's one thing the United States has historically loved more than treaties, it's breaking them for shiny rocks. Suddenly, miners were swarming into your holy lands, guarded by soldiers who acted less like protectors and more like bouncers at a club you weren't invited to. The army decided it was time to bring the Lakota to heel, which is a polite way of saying, crush them. General George Crook led a column of nearly 1,000 men soldiers, scouts, and allies from the Crow and Shoshone tribes into the Rosebud Valley, confident they'd sweep you aside. After all, what could a few thousand Lakota and Cheyenne possibly do against the industrial might of the United States? Turns out, quite a lot. On June 17, 1876, the two forces collided. It wasn't a neat battle lined up for paintings, it was chaos. 6 hours of charges, retreats, ambushes, and dust thick enough to choke on. And right in the heart of it, you crazy horse, not shouting speeches, not waving banners, just doing what you always did, riding directly where the danger was sharpest, pulling warriors with you by sheer force of presence. At one point, Crook's line nearly broke your forces. His soldiers pressed forward, the Crow and Shoshone allies fighting hard at his side. But you led a countercharge so fierce that it shoved the soldiers back, unraveling their momentum. One witness described you riding like a whirlwind, which, considering your vision, was a poetic understatement. And here's the part that textbooks don't always spell out. This battle mattered not because either side held the field at the end, but because of what didn't happen. Crook was supposed to march north and join forces with General Terry and George Armstrong Custer. Together, they would have crushed the Lakota and Cheyenne in one overwhelming blow. But thanks to you, Crook limped away from Rosebud exhausted, demoralized, and unwilling to continue. That delay changed everything. Without Crook, Custer would later march into Little Bighorn, outnumbered, underinformed, and fatally overconfident. Your charge at Rosebud wasn't just a victory, it was the domino that set up the most famous native victory in US history. Of course, you didn't stand on a hill afterward demanding applause. You didn't carve, stopped Crook, you're welcome into a rock. You just returned to camp, silent as always, carrying the weight of lives lost and lives saved. Other leaders gave speeches. You let the dust settle on your shoulders and moved on. But whether you admitted it or not, Rosebud proved something larger. You weren't just a warrior now. You were a strategist, a leader whose presence bent the shape of battles. You didn't need a crown, a throne, or a war drum. All you needed was a horse, loose hair, and that terrifying calm. And just a week later, that calm would ride with you again into the valley of the Little Bighorn, where history itself would be scorched into the earth. If Rosebud was the warm-up act, then the Little Bighorn was the main stage performance, and George Armstrong Custer was about to discover what happens when arrogance meets arithmetic. June 25, 1876, a hot Montana day, the kind where the dust bakes into your throat. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered in a vast village along the Little Bighorn River, a gathering so large it felt less like a camp and more like a city of hides and horses. The U.S. Army thought it had stumbled upon a target. In reality, it had walked into history's best case study in overconfidence. Enter Custer, the blonde peacock of the frontier. He split his force of about 600 men into 3 columns, certain he could surprise and overwhelm the encampment. The man had a knack for underestimating numbers. He thought he was attacking maybe 1,500 warriors. In fact, there were 2 to 3 times that, all very awake, very armed, and very unamused by broken treaties. And you were there, not sitting in the back, not holding strategy meetings in a shaded lodge. You were riding directly into the fray. When the soldiers pressed down toward the village, you led charges so sudden and so fierce they shattered the illusion of us invincibility. Warriors later remembered your voice cutting through the chaos, not a speech, not grand declarations, just urgent words driving men forward. Take courage, charge. Your style wasn't flamboyant. You didn't strut. You didn't paint your face in terrifying symbols. You charged bare, hair streaming loose, as always, the living embodiment of your vision. And that plainness, once again, became your weapon. Soldiers expected war paint and theatrics. Instead, they saw a man riding into gunfire with nothing but determination. That image alone was enough to rattle men trained to fear omens. The fight spiraled quickly. Renault's column faltered, Benteen held back, and Custer, with his vainglorious bravado, found himself surrounded on a hill with 200 men. The end came fast, brutal, and complete. Not a single soldier in Custer's immediate command survived. His last stand became your people's greatest victory. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was vindication. Proof that resistance wasn't just symbolic, it was effective. But here's the irony. For you, Crazy Horse, the battle wasn't about glory. It wasn't about humiliating Custer or proving your name. It was about survival. You fought because encroachment had left no choice. You fought because treaties had been broken, lands invaded, buffalo herds slaughtered. The victory was extraordinary, yes, but it wasn't celebrated with champagne and victory parades. It was mourned as much as cheered, because you knew what was coming. And you were right. The US government didn't shrug and walk away after Little Bighorn. It doubled down. More troops, more forts, more hunger blockades. The battle that made you legendary also ensured the war would tighten its grip. Still, for one scorching day on the Montana plains, your vision lived in full. You charged unpainted, hair loose, humility intact, and the Thunder Being seemed to ride with you. And though you'd never boast, never carve it into stone, history carved it for you. Crazy Horse, the warrior who broke Custer. But leadership isn't just about winning battles. It's about living with what comes after, the expectations, the betrayals, the endless weight of carrying your people's hope. And for you, that weight would grow heavier, even as you tried to keep yourself small, silent, and unadorned. Now here's the part that confuses people raised on Hollywood scripts. You never gave speeches. No, my people, today we fight for freedom moments under dramatic sunsets. You weren't a talker, you were a doer. In fact, you actively avoided standing in the center of camp to shout strategy. While others argued, gestured, and tried to impress with thunderous words, you'd sit at the edge, quiet, eyes down, waiting. And when everyone had exhausted themselves, you'd simply ride into battle, and somehow, that spoke louder than all the noise. Your leadership wasn't about charisma, it was about presence. You had that unnerving ability to pull people forward just by showing up. Warriors would follow you because they saw how you fought, stripped bare, no ornament, no vanity, and they wanted to carry some of that spirit with them. You embodied a kind of bravery that didn't need decoration. You didn't announce yourself. You just appeared, and the tide shifted. And here's where the humor lies. In a culture where generosity was the ultimate flex, you flexed harder than anyone without ever meaning to. After a raid, you'd give away horses instead of boasting about how many you'd taken. You'd share food, distribute goods, and then slink off into the shadows before anyone could shower you with praise. The elders whispered that this was true greatness. The younger men muttered that you were making them all look bad. You didn't care. You lived your vision to the letter. No vanity, no boasting, no theatrics. And yet, that refusal to perform turned into a performance of its own. People told stories about your silence, your humility, your refusal to wear feathers. Ironically, your rejection of attention made you the most talked about man on the plains. Of course, this didn't mean you were universally adored. Some found your style infuriating. They wanted a leader who spoke loudly, who negotiated with dramatic flair, who could out-talk US generals. You weren't that man. You weren't interested in handshakes and diplomacy. You were interested in survival, in defending your people, in keeping the sacred balance of life intact. And if that meant others misunderstood you, so be it. But for those who did follow, your style was magnetic. You didn't tell them what bravery looked like. You showed them. You rode into fire without paint. You stood in the hardest fights without fanfare. You didn't boast afterward. And that silence carried a power speeches could never match. It also carried a certain paranoia. People never quite knew what you were thinking, which made them nervous. Allies respected you, but they couldn't predict you. Enemies feared you, but they couldn't grasp you. You moved like a shadow through war and politics, always visible, never fully knowable. And so your leadership became legend, not for words, but for the absence of them. You were the man who fought hardest and spoke least, the one who gave everything away and seemed to keep nothing for himself. In a world obsessed with noise, you were silenced, and silence, when backed by thunder, is deafening. But even silence can't shield you forever. Leadership attracts shadows, and your growing stature drew not just followers but rivals, both inside and outside the circle of your own people. And when pressure comes from enemies in blue coats and enemies in your own lodges, the weight becomes unbearable. For all the thunder you carried, even you couldn't outrun starvation. By 1877, the buffalo herds had been slaughtered into near extinction. Soldiers prowled the plains like wolves, and the endless war of attrition had ground your people down. Hunger is the oldest enemy in the world, and no matter how many battles you'd won, you couldn't win against empty bellies. So, reluctantly, you led your band to Camp Robinson to surrender. Now, surrender isn't a word anyone likes, especially not in Lakota. It wasn't some Hollywood scene with you handing over a sword while violins swelled. It was grim necessity. Your people were starving. The children's ribs showed, the old men coughed dust. You didn't surrender because you were beaten in spirit. You surrendered because hunger had already done what bullets could not. And even then, you remained unpredictable. At the agency, you refused the role of a pliant captive. You wouldn't sign papers you didn't believe in, wouldn't bend your head for officials who thought they could domesticate you. You kept living as you always had, plain, silent, watchful, and that unnerved everyone. Soldiers whispered. Indian agents fretted. Even some Lakota leaders grew uneasy, because silence, in a world that thrives on control, is terrifying. Whispers grew. They said you were planning to flee the reservation, to gather followers, to spark rebellion. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. The truth hardly mattered. The rumor itself was enough to paint a target on your back. By September, tensions were so high you couldn't move without someone suspecting treason. The end came not on the battlefield, but in the fenced yard of Fort Robinson. You were told to meet with officers to discuss matters. It sounded innocent enough, but by then, you should have known when Empire wants to discuss, bring armor. Instead, you walked into a trap. Soldiers moved to arrest you. Lakota scouts, pressured into playing jailers, stood by. A scuffle broke out. You resisted, tried to break free. In the chaos, a soldier's bayonet found your back. That was it. No final speech. No dramatic duel. Just a blade sliding between your ribs in the confusion of a discussion. Crazy Horse, the man who broke Custer, who rode with thunder, who rejected vanity and ornament, were brought down by bureaucracy with a sharp stick. If it weren't so tragic, it would almost be funny. The most feared warrior on the plains felled, not in battle, but in paperwork gone wrong. They carried you into a room, bleeding. Your father came, stood by you, helpless. The man who had once passed his name to you now watched it fade, and in your last breaths, you remained as you always had, quiet. No grand farewell, no attempt at theatrics. Just silence, leaving others to interpret it as they always had. The irony. In death, you became larger than life. The very people who feared you alive turned you into legend once you were gone, because legends are easier to manage than men. They don't argue, they don't resist, and they don't walk silently around camp, unnerving everyone. But death wasn't the end of your story. Your name, Crazy Horse, became a symbol, carved into memory, carried forward not just by Lakota, but by anyone who ever saw defiance as its own kind of power. And yet, the strangest part of all is this. The man who lived without ornament, who despised vanity, is now remembered in monuments, in poems, in granite so large it could be seen from space. If the Thunder Beings have a sense of humor, they're probably still laughing. You died without a speech, without a treaty, without a trace of compromise. And yet, your name, T.A.K. Whitco, Crazy Horse, grew into something no bayonet could kill. That's the irony of it. The man who hated attention became a monument of memory, larger in death than he ever allowed himself to be in life. Among the Lakota, your story was carried in whispers, not statues. Mothers told children of the warrior who never painted his face, who gave away his horses, who led without words. Elders spoke of your vision, the rider unadorned, guarded by thunder, as if it was still unfolding. You weren't remembered for what you said, because you hardly said anything. You were remembered for how you lived, plain and defiant. But the outside world, well, it has a way of polishing rough truths into tourist-friendly myths. Your image was co-opted, stretched, sometimes twisted. To the US, you became the noble enemy, a tragic figure whose silence was easier to romanticize than his defiance. Historians scribbled, poets sighed, and eventually, bulldozers arrived to carve your likeness into a mountain, a granite colossus rising in South Dakota, the Crazy Horse Memorial, meant to honor you in the very material excess you rejected. Imagine being remembered by the world's largest statue when your entire life was about rejecting vanity. If irony had a patron saint, it would be you. Still, the memorial, flawed as it is, speaks to something real, the way your name refuses to vanish. Unlike so many leaders erased by treaties, by assassinations, by the slow grinding gears of history, you linger, not because you wanted to, but because you couldn't be silenced. Even the US Army that hunted you admitted, grudgingly, that you were unmatched. Custer's defeat ensured you'd never be free, and within Lakota memory, your name became more than a story. It became a mirror. Every time your people spoke it, they remembered the betrayal, the hunger, the broken promises, but also the strength to resist, to ride unpainted, to keep dignity even as the world collapsed around them. That's the true memorial, not granite, but memory, still alive in song and story. Today, your name is invoked everywhere, in classrooms, in activist movements, in native ceremonies, even in casual conversations where people mutter, "We need a crazy horse now." You became shorthand for defiance, for humility that hides fire, for resistance that doesn't need applause. And that's the oddest legacy of all. A man who never wanted to be famous became unavoidable. If you had been born into another world, maybe you would have lived quietly, died quietly, and been remembered only by family. But instead, you were born into thunder, betrayal, and empire. And that turned your name into a banner carried long after your body fell. So here's the legacy. Crazy Horse, the man who refused ornament, became an ornament of history. Crazy Horse, who led in silence, became a voice for generations. Crazy Horse, who rejected vanity, became carved into stone the size of a mountain. The Thunder Beings must still be smirking, because in the end, you didn't just earn your name, you became the contradiction of it. Wild, untamed, unforgettable. And that's the story of the person you could have been. He was born in the season when the earth split open with thunder, when storms seemed to argue above the horizon. No midwife would have dared to call it coincidence. Every cough of the sky was folded into the tale of his arrival, as if nature itself had stamped him with its loud approval. Societies love these omens, hawks flying overhead, a sudden eclipse, a snake slithering too close to the birthing hut. They turn a child into something more than flesh, into a vessel for collective expectation. The mothers whisper, the elders nod, and soon the boy isn't just a boy. He is a promise written into weather and chance. The anthropologists, centuries later, scribbled down that warriors are often foreshadowed this way. A cracked egg in the wrong place, a baby who doesn't cry, or a mark on the skin resembling some animal spirit, all conveniently catalogued as destiny. But what it really did was cage him before he could even crawl. When everyone decides you're born for battle, your lullabies turn into rehearsals for war. And so, even in his cradle-if, you could call packed straw a cradle. He wasn't just an infant, he was already a warning. It's curious how entire kin groups bend around such signs. Resources are quietly shuffled toward the chosen child. Not with overt favoritism, no one dares make it too obvious, but with a kind of collective conspiracy. He receives better scraps of meat, more careful instruction, fewer scoldings for recklessness, because no one wants to be the fool who ignored the storm's command. And by the time he can walk, the boy himself begins to believe the story, as if thunder still rumbles behind his ribs. And what do you do with a child who has already been promised to danger? You give him trials, you strip away softness, you introduce him early to hunger and cold, to see if he bends or breaks. Childhood in his world wasn't padded with toys or lessons in politeness. It was a series of sharpened edges disguised as games, hurling stones farther than anyone else, running until his lungs burned, chasing animals twice his size with nothing but a stick. No one told him these were preparations. They let him think it was play. That's the trick. Make survival feel like amusement, and courage grows roots before fear has language. The first test was never announced as such. It came in the form of a cold night, when older boys were allowed to sleep by the fire, but he was nudged toward the edge, into the draft that cut through the hut. A small cruelty, perhaps, but it spoke volumes. Children in his society weren't eased into adulthood. They were shoved, quite deliberately, into discomfort. Hunger, cold, exhaustion. These were not considered tragedies, but tutors, and the measure of a child's worth was how long he could endure before crying out. Anthropologists like to call this socialization, as if it was some neat classroom exercise. In truth, it was a theater of pain where every stumble, every shiver, was watched closely. If he clenched his jaw and bore it, whispers spread. The omen was proving true. If he faltered, well, then perhaps the storm had chosen poorly. And you can imagine the pressure of that every scraped knee wasn't just a child's injury. It was a referendum on prophecy. Weapons too were introduced early, though not in their deadly form. A carved stick became a spear, a bent branch, a bow, and the game was always the same. Hit farther, faster, with more precision than anyone else. Other children could afford to laugh at mistakes. He couldn't. His errors were met with silence, the kind of silence that weighs more than reprimand. Slowly, courage was drilled into him, not as a choice but as his only currency. To hesitate was to bankrupt the myth, and so childhood became a long rehearsal for fearlessness. Older men would take him on hunts, not to protect him, but to watch. They placed him at the front when crossing rivers, or left him with the task of cornering wounded prey. The message was clear. Courage was not an inner feeling, but a public performance, staged before eyes that judged and remembered. The strangest part is how quickly such performances turn into rituals. When he returned from the hunt with blood on his hands, animal blood at first, the elders nodded, and his body was painted, not for protection, but as a record. Every scar became a line in the story, every success a bead strung on the necklace of inevitability. Childhood, for him, wasn't a prelude to adulthood. It was already a battlefield in miniature, rehearsing a role he could never refuse. And the role only deepened once rituals of courage entered the scene. Those carefully staged ordeals where pain was no longer accidental but sacred, sculpted into the flesh as if bravery needed a brand. Pain has a way of clarifying things. For him, it wasn't simply endured, it was staged, sharpened into spectacle. The society around him didn't leave courage to vague impressions. It had to be proven, carved into the body like a signature you couldn't erase. So the boy, now teetering at the edge of youth, was led into rituals where suffering was both a test and a badge. Scarification was common, sharp stones dragged deliberately across skin, leaving welts that blossomed into permanent patterns. Each mark wasn't decoration, it was a ledger entry. One scar meant a boy had stood firm while others flinched. Another meant he had kept silence when fire touched him. Anthropologists are fond of cataloguing these patterns like art, but they were more brutal than beautiful. They announced to everyone that the child's flesh had been written over by courage. Then came fasting, which sounds tame until you realize it wasn't a day skipped here and there, but whole stretches of time in which food was withheld while work continued. Hunger gnawed at the belly, dreams twisted into visions, and the elders watched for the telltale signs of collapse. The one who stumbled would be remembered for weakness. The one who smiled through cracked lips was whispered about as something more than human. And of course, there was ordeal by panther, kind no outsider could ever mistake for play. Hands held over burning coals, bodies pierced, skin lashed until it bloomed red. But here's the strange logic. These weren't punishments. They were gifts, opportunities to display courage publicly. In such societies, bravery isn't what you feel, it's what you can make visible. The young warrior learned early that agony wasn't an enemy, it was a stage prop. By the end of these rites, his body was no longer just his own. It had become a canvas of endurance, a living archive that told anyone who looked at him, here stands one who does not fear pain, and therefore does not fear death. The rituals gave him something no child is born with, an aura of inevitability. Courage was no longer just expected. It was demanded and stamped onto his flesh in ways impossible to deny. And when you hold yourself like that, when your very skin tells others you won't back down, the weapon in your hand stops being an object. It becomes an extension, a second limb, a piece of your very identity. The first weapon he held wasn't handed down casually. It was given with ceremony, as if the transfer of wood and stone was really the transfer of lineage. Anthropologists will note that across warrior societies, a spear or bow isn't simply a tool. It's a biography disguised as sharpened matter. The shaft might carry carvings echoing clan marks, the string twisted from animal sinew hunted by an uncle, the tip blackened in fire that had burned for generations. To hold it was to grip not just an object, but a memory. For him, the weapon became an organ-on attachment that blurred into the flesh. Children of quieter fates might grow attached to pets or toys. His intimacy was with iron and wood. When he slept, the spear was close enough to touch. When he bathed in the river, it rested on the bank, watching like a sentinel. People whispered that he never walked unarmed, but the truth was simpler. To leave the weapon behind was to amputate part of himself. It's worth pausing on how societies sanctify these objects. A warrior's spear might be fed with blood before battle, or his bow strung only after chance called on the ancestors. Some groups smeared weapons with ash from funeral pyres, binding the dead to the living. The logic is chilling, but clear if courage was already inscribed on his skin. Then the weapon was the echo, the outward declaration. Together, they made him more than a man. They made him a figure difficult to face without trembling. This bond between man and weapon wasn't just personal, it was social theater. Others needed to see that the spear wasn't inert, that it belonged only in his hands. When he raised it in practice, even casually, people stepped back. Courage radiates, but fear multiplies through props. His courage, visible through scars and silence, became amplified in the long shadow of sharpened wood. And when fear takes root, it spreads. To be feared isn't merely to inspire dread in enemies, it's to rearrange the entire balance of power around you. Families sleep easier, rivals hesitate longer, leaders grant more authority. His courage was already a resource, but once attached to weapons, it hardened into a social force that others could not ignore. Fear works like a currency, only more efficient. It doesn't need to be minted or carried in sacks. It circulates invisibly, shaping choices before they're even spoken aloud. For him, courage became terrifying precisely because it was consistent. People fear the unpredictable, yes, but they fear even more the man who always stands his ground, who never shows a crack. That kind of certainty makes others second-guess their own survival instincts. Among his people, fear wasn't an accident, it was cultivated. A warrior's reputation wasn't measured just by the bodies he felled, but by the pauses he created in conversation. If an enemy hesitated before approaching, if children hushed when he walked past, that was power more durable than any blade. To be feared meant you could protect your kin without ever lifting a hand, because your name alone did the work of 100 spears. Anthropologists often describe this as deterrence, but the word is too clean. What was happening was social gravity. His courage bent the air around him, and others orbited cautiously, afraid to trespass. Even allies weren't immune. Courage of that magnitude unsettles everyone. It forces comparisons, whispers, quiet resentments. Yet those same allies clung to his shadow, because fear, when properly aimed, made a village safer than walls ever could. It's worth noting how stories feed this machine. A single act of bravery grows in the retelling, acquiring sharper teeth with every mouth it passes through. Soon, he wasn't just a warrior, he was a storm given legs. His courage became a rumor, and rumors have the peculiar ability to travel farther than arrows. Long before enemies saw him, they feared him, which was exactly the point. And fear, once set in motion, transforms war itself. Battles stop being contests of strength and become stages for theater, where dread is painted as thickly as blood. The warrior steps forward not only to fight, but to perform fear, to wield it as deliberately as any weapon. Battles, after all, weren't silent affairs of hidden daggers in the dark. They were loud, deliberate, almost operatic. War was theater, and he played the lead role with unnerving ease. Before weapons even clashed, the body itself became a stage. Faces streaked with ash or ochre, hair twisted into forms that caught the sun, torsos marked with scars or paint that shouted louder than words. Here is one who cannot be broken. The first strike wasn't a spear through the air, but the war cry, high guttural piercing. It carried across valleys and rattled inside rib cages. Warriors knew the point wasn't just to signal readiness, it was to make fear arrive early, to let the enemy's hands tremble before the fight began. He perfected this kind of vocal theater, his voice carrying stories of storms and deaths past, a sound that seemed less human and more elemental. Dance had its place, not graceful, but deliberate steps pounding the ground to mimic thunder, arms slicing the air in mock strikes. Movements rehearsed in the safety of the village erupted here as choreography of menace. War became less about who could kill and more about who could terrify before killing even started. In such performances, his courage shone in its most dangerous form. Not only did he refuse fear, he manufactured it in others. Anthropologists like to note that this blending of art and combat is nearly universal. The feathers, drums, chants, and scars are often described as decoration, but they were weapons in themselves, striking long before the spear point touched flesh. And in his case, courage acted like fuel for the spectacle. He didn't just enter battle, he staged it, each gesture amplifying his reputation until he seemed less like a man and more like inevitability personified. But the stage has one ultimate prop: death itself. And the closer a warrior stands to it without flinching, the more terrifying his presence becomes. Death lingered at the edge of every skirmish, but for him it wasn't a shadow, it was a companion. Societies often measure courage, not by how many lives you take, but by how willing you are to hand over your own without bargaining. He carried himself with the unsettling calm of someone already acquainted with the grave. To fight a man who doesn't care if he dies is to confront the one thing no blade can cut: inevitability. Across cultures, warriors like him were made untouchable precisely through this refusal to flinch. Among the Celts, a man might rush into battle naked, inviting death with nothing but painted skin. Among certain steppe riders, songs of their own funeral were sung before combat, turning the battlefield into a rehearsal for burial. He stood in that lineage, where readiness to die wasn't foolish bravado but the ultimate weapon. Courage tethered so tightly to death becomes infectious. Enemies hesitate, allies feel shielded, and the man himself grows mythic. The anthropology of it is almost mathematical. If pain is endured in ritual, and fear is transformed into spectacle, then death becomes the final equation to solve. He stepped into each clash, not as someone gambling with survival, but as someone who had already settled his debts. In a world where most men cling desperately to life, this made him terrifying. You cannot bargain with the fearless. And still, courage doesn't exist in silence. It needs witnesses. It needs echoes. Death alone proves little unless the living are there to weave it into story. That was the strange alchemy of his life. Every brush with mortality was gathered, retold, embroidered into memory. And those memories, passed from mouth to mouth, became a kind of armor stronger than bone, which leads, inevitably, to how stories and memory did more for his reputation than any weapon or wound ever could. Stories did what scars could not. They traveled, around fires, in the pauses between hunts, on the lips of traders who carried gossip farther than arrows. His courage grew a second life. What began as a single act to stand against overwhelming odds, a refusal to retreat when others broke, turned into legend with every retelling. By the third telling, enemies numbered in dozens. By the 10th, he was fighting whole battalions alone. Exaggeration wasn't dishonesty, it was tribute. Anthropologists often remark that oral traditions inflate deeds, but inflation was the point. In societies without statues or written chronicles, a man survived only in sound. His name became a talisman. Children were hushed with it. Warriors measured themselves against it. Rivals feared it long before they met him. To be remembered this way was to become untouchable, because stories don't bleed. The process is strangely democratic. Every person who retold his feats added a brushstroke, shaping him into more than human. Sometimes his courage was described as supernatural, a gift from spirits. Other times, it was reduced to stubbornness so complete it bordered on madness. Both versions served the same function. They ensured no one forgot. Fear of him wasn't just immediate. It lingered across distances and generations, rooted in tales that traveled faster than he ever could. In this sense, his courage became communal property. Elders leaned on his name to instruct the young. Leaders invoked him to stiffen spines before raids. Even in his absence, he was present. That's the unsettling thing about memory. It doesn't just record history, it manufactures reputation, often more durable than the man himself. But memory isn't neutral. It ties into expectations of what a man should be, how he should embody strength, protect, dominate, or terrify. And here courage became tangled with gender, power, and the larger machinery of fear that kept society itself in order. Courage, in his world, wasn't simply admired, it defined masculinity itself. To be a man meant to carry fear on your shoulders without flinching, and he embodied that standard so perfectly that others found themselves dwarfed beside him. Anthropologists point out that warrior cultures often use a single figure to crystallize their ideals, a kind of living yardstick against which all others are measured. He became that yardstick, and it was a heavy role to inhabit. Fear, then, wasn't just projected outward toward enemies. It circulated inward, structuring daily life. Young boys were reminded that hesitation would shame their mothers. Women were told that only the brave could guard them, and rival men learned to bite back envy in silence. His courage rippled through the social order, setting boundaries of who held power and who lived in his shadow. Even allies weren't entirely comfortable. Respect bled easily into intimidation, and the relationship between men and women, too, was colored by this atmosphere. A warrior of his stature wasn't simply a fighter. He was a symbol of fertility, of continuity, of a society's claim to strength. Women praised his courage publicly, but privately may have feared what it meant to live beside someone who never showed weakness. The line between protector and threat was thinner than most dared to admit. In this way, courage wasn't an individual trait, but a social mechanism. It regulated marriage choices, inheritance, political authority. To be fearless made him desirable, indispensable, but also deeply isolating. For while others spoke his name with awe, they did so from a distance. Courage had made him the most feared, but it also made him the most alone. And still, isolation has its counterweight, legacy. For if he couldn't be fully claimed by the living, then death would ensure he was never released, his memory entombed in rituals, his courage converted into something eternal. When he finally fell, it wasn't the silence of death that mattered, but the choreography that followed. Bodies of ordinary men might be buried quickly, tucked into the earth with minimal fuss. His was different. Warriors of his kind were not simply disposed of, they were staged, transformed into symbols one last time. The funeral became a mirror of his life, loud, deliberate, saturated with meaning. Weapons were laid beside him, sometimes broken, sometimes bloodied anew, as if their service had to end with his ashes from communal fires marked his skin, binding him back to the village that had once whispered omens at his birth. Some say bones of enemies were left at his grave, less for practicality than for memory reminders that courage, once displayed, could echo into eternity. Anthropologists note that such burials were rarely about the dead themselves. They were about the living, about the continuation of a narrative that bound society together. To bury him with spectacle was to remind the next generation that courage doesn't dissolve with the body. His scars, his weapon, his fearlessness soul became currency in a spiritual economy that traded in memory and power. And legacy is a strange creature. His name lingered not only in songs but in political disputes, invoked by leaders long after his bones turned to dust. Children played at being him, mimicking his stance, his cry, his indifference to death. The most feared warrior of his time had ceased to exist as a man, yet as a story, he multiplied. Death hadn't closed his life, it had expanded it into something inescapable. In the end, his courage was never just his own. It had been taken, shaped, retold, and passed forward until it belonged to everyone and no one. That is the quiet irony of fear. It begins as a private act of defiance, but it ends as a public inheritance. And so he lived on, less in flesh than in the tremor of memory, the unease of silence before a name is spoken. Death is supposed to silence a person, but in most societies it tends to make them speak louder. The flesh sinks into the earth, sure, but what rises is something strangely more enduring. The legend. Among the ancient Greeks, a man could spend his whole life doing nothing extraordinary. Yet if he died in a spectacularly inconvenient way struck by lightning on a clear day, say his neighbors might whisper that Zeus had taken an interest. The act of dying itself was interpreted as a kind of message, as though the manner of one's departure revealed truths that had been hidden in life. Anthropologists who study mortuary rituals notice this pattern everywhere. Death is rarely seen as a conclusion. Among the Toraja of Sulawesi, the dead are not considered fully gone until elaborate rites have been performed, sometimes months or even years later. The corpse lingers in the house, dressed, spoken to, and treated as part of the family. What is lost biologically gets kept socially. In other words, death doesn't end, someone it relocates them. And once the relocation is complete, the deceased often returns, not as an individual but as an emblem. Think of medieval saints whose lives might have been messy, full of contradictions, but whose deaths, usually violent, soaked in blood and public spectacle, made them suddenly coherent. A single moment could erase decades of ambiguity. Dying, in a way, edits a life. It cuts the messy manuscript short, leaving only the neat final page. The irony is almost cruel. While living, one struggles for recognition. In death, one cannot stop being recognized. Legends thrive precisely because the body is no longer there to contradict them. A dead king doesn't make bad decisions. A dead revolutionary doesn't betray his followers. A dead prophet doesn't change his mind. What remains is the unbending shape of a myth. And myths, unlike people, never grow tired or inconvenient. They feed on memory, and memory is far easier to embellish once the source material is in the ground. Which is why, the moment someone dies, the real work of keeping them alive begins through mourning, through ritual, and through the strange art of inflating a body's absence into something that feels larger than its presence ever did. If death opens the door, martyrdom slams it shut in a way that echoes forever. There's a reason why those who die unjustly, violently, or theatrically rarely stay quiet in the collective imagination. Anthropologists point out that societies latch onto these figures because their deaths don't just end life, they expose a crack in the order of things. A man executed publicly for defying an empire, a woman burned for heresy, a soldier falling in a hopeless last stand. These are not merely deaths, they're moral advertisements. Take Joan of Arc. Her short life was turbulent, confusing, and at times politically inconvenient, but her death consumed by fire while reciting prayers simplified her into something immortal. By burning, she became untouchable. It's almost perverse. The flames intended to destroy her instead preserved her, like a saint embalmed, not in oil but in smoke. People saw the injustice, and the narrative wrote itself. The authorities wanted silence. What they got was a chorus. This is the power of martyrdom. It strips away the dull edges of existence and leaves only the sharp point of a message. The Aztecs understood this quite well. Warriors captured in battle were sacrificed on temple altars, their blood staining the steps in front of vast crowds. Brutal, yes, but also a public performance that reframed death as cosmic necessity. For those societies, the violent end didn't erase the man it turned him into fuel, a vessel carrying life to gods and legitimacy to rulers. Even modern states play the same card, albeit with subtler rituals. Political funerals, televised with precision, transform a corpse into a flag. Mourners line the streets, flowers rain down on coffins, speeches drone about sacrifice and destiny. The death is marketed, the individual is gone, but their absence is repackaged into a tool, sometimes of hope, sometimes of control. So while ordinary deaths fade into private grief, martyrdom refuses to stay indoors. It takes over plazas, calendars, and history books. It makes sure that the dead keep working long after their bodies have stopped. And if martyrdom is the spark, the rituals of mourning are the machinery that keeps the fire going, turning grief into something louder, heavier, and far more enduring than tears. Grief, left alone, is quiet. It sits in the corner of a house, in the silence after a meal, in the clothes no one dares to fold away. But grief in public is never quiet. It's amplified, staged, and often orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Anthropologists have long noticed that when someone dies, and especially when someone important dies, what follows is less a farewell and more a performance designed to make absence unforgettable. Consider ancient Egypt. Pharaohs were buried with processions so elaborate that they lasted for weeks. Professional mourners wailed in carefully choreographed rhythms, their bodies covered in dust, their hair torn out in theatrical despair. Was all of it spontaneous sorrow? Hardly. It was spectacle, a way of taking raw grief and hammering it into something that could be repeated, remembered, and, most importantly, witnessed. Or look at Victorian England, where mourning was practically a fashion industry. Widows in black veils, lockets holding a curl of hair, even entire rooms of houses draped in heavy fabric, so that death was literally stitched into domestic life. It wasn't enough to suffer. One had to show the suffering, like an opera staged in every parlor. and with every display, the deceased's presence was paradoxically magnified, their memory echoing louder with each carefully arranged sigh. Even in more recent times, the same logic persists. When Princess Diana died in 1997, mountains of flowers piled up outside Kensington Palace until the streets resembled a botanic graveyard. The sheer excess of mourning transformed her from a divisive public figure into an untouchable symbol of loss. The ritual itself, repeated endlessly on television screens, wrote her life. That's the peculiar thing. Mourning doesn't just preserve memory, it edits it. Rituals of grief amplify some details, erase others, and shape the deceased into whatever form best suits the collective mood. Tears become amplifiers, coffins become stages, and the dead are suddenly louder than they ever were alive. And once the ritual has done its work, what remains is fertile ground for the next step, storytelling. Because no amount of wailing or draped velvet keeps a legend alive as effectively as a story retold, reshaped, and whispered into permanence. Once the wailing fades and the last flower wilts, what really matters is who keeps talking. Death might silence a body, but stories keep the voice echoing long after the grave has settled. Anthropologists often remind us that oral tradition is not just about preserving history, it's about bending it into something worth repeating. The dead, when retold, are rarely the same people they were when breathing. They become edited versions, tighter, cleaner, and far more interesting. Think of Achilles. If Homer hadn't sung about him, he would have been just another Bronze Age fighter who died on a battlefield like countless others. Instead, his death by an arrow through the heel, likely apocryphal, definitely poetic, turned him into shorthand for both invincibility and fragility. In the retelling, the messy contradictions of a life collapse into a symbol anyone can summon with a single phrase: Achilles' heel. In West African griot traditions, this power of storytelling is even more explicit. A warrior might fall in combat, his body quickly forgotten, but the griot's voice could stretch his memory across generations, reciting his bravery until it was less a fact than a rhythm. The longer the story was told, the less it belonged to the man and the more it belonged to the community. Immortality wasn't celestial, it was social, vibrating in the air each time his name was chanted. And stories, unlike rituals, travel. They seep into new languages, cross rivers, take root in places where the dead themselves never set foot. Joan of Arc, Che Guevara, Tupac Shakur, all very different figures, but each became more than a corpse because stories about them refused to die. Whether whispered in kitchens, sung in protest songs, or plastered on posters, these tales don't just preserve memory, they overwrite it, turning complex human beings into archetypes. It's through storytelling that legends stop being local and start being universal. The dead can then slip into dreams, cautionary fables, or bedtime myths. And once they've entered that realm, it's only a short step before they're imagined, not just as remembered figures, but as active presences, protectors, avengers, restless spirits, walking back into the living world. The line between remembering the dead and summoning them is dangerously thin. Once stories solidify, they often grant the deceased a peculiar kind of agency, if they're not content to stay embalmed in words, but prefer to keep walking. Among the living, anthropologists studying ancestor cults notice this everywhere. The dead are rarely just passive memories. They protect, they punish, and occasionally they meddle with a cruelty only the living call unfair. Take the Romans, who believed in the manes, household spirits of the departed. A neglected ancestor could sour the milk, blight the crops, or slip into your dreams with complaints. Meanwhile, a properly honored ancestor became a guardian, a sort of invisible bureaucrat in the family's daily affairs. Your grandmother might be dead, but if you poured out wine for her and kept her name alive at the hearth, she might keep watch, nudging fate in your favor. In West African traditions, spirits of the dead often carry even sharper edges. Among the Yoruba, ancestors can intervene in matters of justice, sometimes ensuring that a lie is exposed or a betrayal avenged. Death frees them from the slow pace of human law. If the courts are corrupt, the ancestors are not, and their verdicts arrive as illness, misfortune, or sheer bad luck for the guilty. Even in Christian Europe, saints functioned similarly. A murdered martyr could return as a miracle worker, healing the faithful, punishing tyrants, or making battlefield appearances long after their bones had settled into reliquaries. Death, in these cases, was less a departure than a promotion, from fragile body to incorruptible force. And yet, this belief in the dead's continued agency isn't just about comfort, it's also about fear. To imagine the deceased as avengers is to admit that wrongs cannot be neatly buried with the body. Some debts remain open, some betrayals call for ghostly accounting, which is precisely why political regimes and churches alike have always tried to manage the dead carefully, because restless spirits, whether saints or rebels, are difficult to control once people start believing they're still around. That makes the next step almost inevitable. Once the dead are given voices and powers, they also become useful tools, and few know how to wield them better than the living who seek power themselves. It's remarkable how quickly a corpse can be repurposed into a banner. Once the tears have dried and the stories have begun, the dead often find themselves drafted into political service, pressed into causes they might never have chosen while alive. Anthropologists have long observed this curious recycling. The dead, stripped of their human messences, make perfect symbols. They can't contradict, they can't negotiate, and they certainly can't resign. Think of Lenin. His body, embalmed and displayed in Moscow since 1924, was turned into a kind of eternal statesman, silently presiding over the Soviet experiment long after the revolution had eaten itself. The man may have coughed blood into handkerchiefs in life, but in death, he was pure marble, pure myth. His corpse became a political prop, a constant reminder that the revolution had divine sanction, at least in the frozen glow of Red Square. Or Che Guevara, whose photograph after his execution in Bolivia was posed almost like a Renaissance painting of the dead Christ. Instead of ending his influence, his death transformed him into a permanent guerrilla icon, plastered on walls and t-shirts from Havana to Hanoi. It's no accident that revolutions so often circulate images of their dead heroes. The image outlives the man, and the message becomes easier to control. Even monarchies, supposedly allergic to revolution, have played this game. The death of a king could be spun into proof of divine favor or divine wrath. In medieval France, the sudden demise of a ruler might be framed as God calling his servant home, a neat way to smother whispers of incompetence or scandal. The crown simply slid from one skull to another, but the dead monarch's absence was used to legitimize the living one. The irony, of course, is that the dead are most useful precisely because they can't object. A murdered dissident becomes the state's villain or the people's saint, depending on who's telling the story. The bones are mute, but the speeches around them are deafening. And when words aren't enough, bodies themselves, hair, teeth, bones are pressed into service. The relics of the dead, paraded and worshipped, extend their political power into the tactile, the visible, the touchable, which is why the next stage in this transformation is so crucial. The body itself, broken down, becomes a relic that still demands allegiance. When words and symbols start to fade, the body steps back, though usually in fragments. Across cultures, relics become the anchor that ties the myth to something tangible. Bones, hair, even teeth serve as stubborn reminders that the person once occupied space in the world, and they keep drawing crowds centuries later. Anthropologists call this the material afterlife, the transformation of flesh into objects of devotion. Medieval Europe was practically addicted to relics. The femur of a saint could legitimize a cathedral. The skull of a martyr could bring pilgrims from across the continent. Entire economies grew around these bones, traded like holy currency, each one promising access to divine power. Whether or not the relic was genuine mattered less than the fervor it inspired. Faith, after all, doesn't demand carbon dating, but the practice isn't uniquely Christian. In Tibetan Buddhism, the cremation of holy figures often yields small pearl-like relics called ringsel, believed to be physical crystallizations of spiritual energy. These fragments are enshrined, carried in amulets, or installed in stupas, extending the authority of the deceased into new generations. The body refuses to vanish neatly into ash. It insists on leaving pieces behind. Even in more political contexts, relics are wielded with precision. The heart of Chopin, smuggled into Poland and entombed in a church pillar, became more than an organ. It was a relic of national identity. Pilgrims didn't travel to hear him play, but to be reassured that a part of him, however strange and shrunken, still pulsed within their country's walls. Relics, whether sacred or secular, convert decay into permanence. They make absence touchable, and in doing so, they create endless opportunities for control. Touch the bone, touch the saint, glimpse the skull, glimpse eternity, handle the tooth, handle history itself. And once the bones are secured, the next step is inevitable. They must be seen. Images, paintings, effigies all become the visual scaffolding that keeps the dead from slipping into mere memory. Bones may be powerful, but they're inconvenient, fragile, and prone to being stolen by rival monasteries or ambitious collectors. Images, on the other hand, travel effortlessly. Once the dead are drawn, painted, sculpted, or printed, they slip into every corner of society, far outliving their brittle remains. Anthropologists note that images aren't just representations, they're extensions of presence, allowing the dead to continue haunting the living without the logistics of bone transport. Consider the Christian icons of saints, their faces replicated endlessly on wood panels, walls, and tiny lockets. The believer who kissed a painted image wasn't thinking of pigment and varnish, they were convinced they were brushing lips against the saint themselves. Representation became incarnation. The dead were made portable, distributable, and above all, unerasable. Or look at ancient China, where portraiture of ancestors was essential to ritual practice. Families commissioned paintings of their departed, not for nostalgia but to provide a face for the rites. These images were seated at banquets, offered food and incense, treated as honored guests. Without a body, the portrait became the locus of respect and obligation. In more modern contexts, photography has only intensified this dynamic. Think of the famous post-mortem photographs of the 19th century, where children and adults alike were posed as though asleep, their images cherished long after the coffin was buried. Or the iconic Che Guevara photograph, duplicated to infinity, turning a slain revolutionary into a global logo. The face, multiplied, became the myth. Images do something relics cannot. They democratize immortality. A fragment of bone can only be in one place, but an image can be everywhere, all at once. With every reproduction, the legend spreads, and the dead continue to glare, smile, or mourn wherever their likeness lands. And yet, an image, like a relic, risks fading without rhythm to sustain it, which is why the next layer is always ritualized repetitions and anniversaries, feast days, national holidays, mechanisms that ensure the dead are not just remembered, but scheduled into the very structure of time. Memory, left unchecked, has a habit of dissolving, which is why societies pin their legends to the calendar, making sure the dead are never allowed to fade into the background hum of history. Death becomes an annual appointment, a ritual interruption of ordinary time. Anthropologists see this as one of the most effective tools for keeping a legend alive, not just remembering, but rehearsing the memory on cue. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos blends pre-Columbian ancestor rites with Catholic feast days, transforming cemeteries into carnivals of color and food. Families return to graves with marigolds, sugar skulls, and offerings, ensuring the departed are not merely recalled, but actively hosted. Death is not only present, it's scheduled, expected, and celebrated as part of the yearly cycle. In the Christian West, saints' feast days served a similar purpose. Every year, the faithful would gather to honor the martyrdom of a saint, reenacting their suffering through prayer, plays, or processions. Time itself bent around the dead, embedding them into the rhythms of work, fasting, and feast. Without these recurring markers, many saints might have been forgotten within a generation. Instead, their names became fixtures of the calendar, as reliable as the harvest or the solstice. Even secular figures are locked into this pattern. National heroes get public holidays, revolutionaries get commemorations, assassinated leaders have eternal flame monuments that demand yearly attention. The American memory of Martin Luther King Jr. or the Indian remembrance of Gandhi isn't accidental, it's enforced by repetition, by the official decree that every January or October, society must pause and replay the death, the life, and the message. This annual choreography of grief and pride doesn't just preserve memory, it deepens it. With every repetition, the dead are polished like stones, their rough edges worn smooth by ritual use. They stop belonging to history and start belonging to time itself, woven into the clockwork of cultural identity. But repetition alone can't explain the sheer persistence of some figures, who grow larger, stranger, and more untouchable the further they drift from their actual lives. That final liptha transformation from decaying flesh into an eternal narrative is where death's true alchemy lies. In the end, what lingers isn't the body, the relic, or even the anniversary procession. What endures is the story sharpened, polished, and retold until it no longer belongs to the dead at all, but to everyone who repeats it. Anthropologists sometimes describe this as the final metamorphosis, the slide from biography into myth. Flesh dissolves, memory condenses, and the legend becomes an eternal script, ready to be rehearsed by each new generation. Take Gilgamesh. If he ever lived, he's long since dust, but his death birthed the first great epic, stitched together by Mesopotamian scribes who probably knew they were already dealing in legend rather than fact. Or consider Jesus of Nazareth, a crucified man in a backwater province whose story, retold and ritualized, became the foundation of an entire civilization. His flesh vanished quickly enough, but the narrative refused to die. The story was stronger than the body, and still is. This is the paradox of death. It's final for the individual, but endlessly fertile for culture. Once a person is no longer capable of contradiction, reinvention begins. The coward becomes the brave martyr, the heretic becomes the saint, the rebel becomes the founding father. Legends are made of omissions as much as of truths, and death provides the perfect eraser. The result is a strange kind of immortality, not the literal living forever, but the more potent form, living in the mouths, calendars, and imaginations of the living. The legend doesn't age, doesn't tire, doesn't decay. It's rehearsed endlessly, sliding from temple to textbook, from whispered prayer to viral poster. So when death arrives, it's not the end of a story, it's the beginning of its longest chapter. The grave closes, and the legend opens. And the living, in their need for heroes, martyrs, protectors, or cautionary tales, keep turning the pages long after the flesh has been forgotten.